And on behalf of General Coolidge and all of the staff here at the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, now on we'll just say the Hub, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you for joining us here today on our 7th Southern Talks concerned with the African Standby Force, with particular reference to the maritime domain and the current situation in the Red Sea. My name is 𝒂𝒎𝒑𝒔𝒕𝒂𝒎💑 and I am part of the knowledge management team here at the Hub. Today, as I said, is the 7th of our Southern Talks, where we invite experts to discuss their perspectives on topics related to peace and security in Africa and the Middle East. If you've not seen our previous Southern Talks, please feel free to look up our YouTube channel at 𝒂𝒒𝒏 or at NSD-Hub. This event is also being recorded, and it will be available for viewing in the next few days. We're streaming live on Zoom and on YouTube on our channel. Just a quick reminder that all of those registered and watching on Zoom may send us questions using the chat box during the event, and towards the end of the event we will have a questions and answers section. And so to today's event, we are honored and delighted to have Dr. Ian Ralby, founder and CEO of 𝒂𝒒𝒒𝒒𝒒𝒒𝒐𝒑𝒂𝒎𝒑𝒔. Good morning and welcome to you, Ian.
Thank you very much.
Ian is a hugely knowledgeable and well-recognized expert on maritime security, and we are very much looking forward to benefiting from your wealth of knowledge and experience on the topic of the African Standby Force and maritime security. So, Ian, welcome.
Thank you very much.
If you'd like, please, a few more words about yourself so that we can introduce you properly to all of our audience.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back at the Hub. I have been coming here over the years, and it's been a pleasure to get to engage on a number of different topics. So I'm really glad to speak about both the African Standby Force and some of what's happening today around the continent. I am a maritime lawyer by background, and I say that with a degree of contrition. I apologize, but my mindset in terms of pursuing maritime security is often grounded in how do we establish and maintain the rule of law. But it also colors my thinking about topics like this, where we have a legal mandate for something, and we should probably pay attention to what that mandate looks like, what it says. Let's be rigorous about it. And so, I've had the opportunity to work with lots of different multinational entities. I've worked physically in 95 countries around the world. I've worked with more than 135 navies and coast guards. And there's a tendency that we often have to look at an issue, talk about a solution, and then sort of forget both what that issue started with and what that solution was initiated by. And we have to fight that tendency to allow the colloquial to replace the rigorous. And so what I want to share a little bit is somewhat of a dive into those aspects around the African Standby Force and maritime security in Africa.
Right. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to learning as much as possible from you. So please, be our guest.
Well, I think a great starting point for this discussion is to say that the Africa Standby Force has been a concept that has been discussed for a very long time. What it is and how it works is a bit of a mystery because it hasn't ever met fruition fully. And so, we're sitting in a NATO facility, and we often have concepts about what standby forces look like when we come at it from a NATO mindset, because we use the same terminology. And the first thing we have to do is relieve ourselves of those assumptions based on what we already know. And so let's take a look back at the history of the Africa Standby Force and what it has and hasn't been. So at the outset, this is a concept that has been discussed in Africa for a long time, including prior to the establishment of the African Union. So back in the days of the Organization of African Unity, the notion that there should be a multinational force of some sort able to do certain things in the continent was discussed. But it was only in 2002, with the establishment of the African Union itself, that under the establishment of the Peace and Security Council, did we have an articulation in writing, codified, Article 13, that said what this standby force would look like. And I want to just turn our attention back to July 2002, and I promise I won't do much reading, but there are a couple of points that are worth highlighting, because if we don't look at the mandate, we can't look at what it's actually supposed to cover.
Right.
So there are 7 aspects that the African Standby Force was supposed to cover. The first were observer and monitoring missions. The second were other peace support missions. The third were interventions in states with grave circumstances of different sorts. The fourth was prevention through deployment, including to deal with disputes or conflicts that were escalating, so stop them from escalating, stop ongoing conflict from continuing, and stop or prevent the resurgence of violence after a conflict. Peace building and democracy, demilitarization and reintegration, and then humanitarian assistance. Those 6 are the articulated ones, and then there's a 7th kind of catch-all, which is anything else that the Peace and Security Council would authorize. You'll note that not one of those mentions naval operations, maritime security, maritime law enforcement, or anything involving the maritime domain. And so that's an important piece. So that was the starting point. None of it was focused on the maritime domain. Almost all of it looking at either conflicts or responses to some kind of grave circumstances on land within the member states of the African Union. Now, in 2003, as the implementation of this directive got going, they came up with 6 different scenarios where the African Standby Force would potentially be used. The first were in military advisory capacities to political missions. So advisory being one of the ones that isn't really mentioned in those 7 functions, but is kind of implied in them. The second would be observer missions that would be co-deployed with UN deployments. The third were observer missions that would be standalone, so without the UN. The fourth were peacekeeping and preventative deployments. The fifth was kind of a strange one because it's peacekeeping, but multidimensional. So dealing with other aspects beyond just stopping the conflict. And the sixth were interventions where the international community did not step in, like with the case of genocide. So those are the 6 contexts. Again, not one of them mentions naval activities, maritime security, maritime law enforcement, any of it. And so as we've seen from 2003 on, the African Standby Force developed a sort of a concept of operations involving different brigades at the regional level. So there was the North, South, East, West, and Central brigades, some of which have developed differently depending on their respective economic communities that have sort of supported them. But as of 2016, the notion was that these rapid support or rapid response forces were ready to go. And yet we've never seen them actually implemented. To this date, to 2024, the African Standby Force is a concept only. It does exist in terms of brigade organizations, but in terms of actual deployments, never fully authorized. And there are a couple of reasons behind that. First is that the African Union has, in certain contexts, come up with their own ad hoc deployments of different forces. But equally, there's a challenge here, and this is where we go back to distinguishing Africa Standby Force from a NATO Standby Force.
Right.
NATO is an alliance focused on collective self-defense from an outside actor. So it is the membership protecting itself from something outside. The Africa Standby Force is primarily inward focused. So you're looking at issues within member states. That brings up all kinds of challenges of even admitting the type of problem that may be used to exist. So, you know, by saying we're going to deploy in order to stop genocide, you have to first admit that there's a genocide.
Right.
In order to deploy to intervene in a conflict, you have to admit that there's a conflict that is escalating, that is ongoing, that is, and sometimes that is politically challenging to do, especially when the party that is experiencing the conflict or experiencing the genocide or experiencing any of these things is a member of the organization that's making that decision.
Right.
So that is one of the mitigating factors. The other is that there's an ongoing sort of uncertainty as to whether some other resolution, a UN Security Council resolution, for example, is needed in order to be able to authorize the use of force to pursue one of those missions. And so that has all sort of led to this almost inertia around actually using the Africa Standby Force. And I think that difference between the collective defense and the internal look is really important to keep in mind. The other thing that's important to look at is most of the functions that we're looking at are about either peacekeeping or stopping, preventing, dealing with conflict.
Right.
Armed conflict, military function makes sense. A lot of the issues that occur in the maritime space, at least historically, over the last several decades, have been law enforcement issues, which require the member state in which they are occurring to be prepared to prosecute in some way. It's not about stopping conflict, it's about changing a security environment through a whole law enforcement ecosystem where not only is there interdiction, there's also some kind of prosecution. And so that's a completely different creature than a multinational force is used to dealing with. When NATO operates, it's not grabbing bad guys and putting them into a domestic prison, and so that's where there's sort of a mismatch in terms of the mentality. And so while piracy, for example, is a threat that is on its terms, pirates are considered Houthis 𝒂𝒒𝒔𝒕𝒂𝒎𝒑𝒔, enemies of all mankind, right? So they under Article 110 of UNCLOS, they are considered one of the 3 crimes that have universal jurisdiction for boarding. So anywhere outside of 12 nautical miles, any state in the world can stop pirates. So that gives a degree of flexibility in terms of interdicting them. But still, even prosecuting them became one of our biggest challenges back when NATO Ocean Shield was operating off the Horn of Africa some 15 years ago now. And so this sort of mismatch of dealing with conflict versus dealing with a law enforcement or a security threat at a national level is part of the inertia around implementing an Africa Standby Force concept in the maritime domain. The other problem is that there has been a lack of thinking regarding how you actually would put this into effect at an operational level. What resources is anybody realistically looking to use? I interviewed a lot of people when doing some work for NATO on the Africa Standby Force. I interviewed a lot of African naval personnel, and a lot of them pointed out, look, we struggle at the national level to get a vessel out underway and go and do something. How are we supposed to then work in a multinational context with that same asset? It's not like there are other assets coming in. It's a subsidiarity principle. So you're starting with a member state capacity and then sort of sharing it. So if you have none to begin with, or a real challenge of marshaling the resources that you have, how are you supposed to accomplish something even bigger? And so realistically, a lot of the hesitation or the reluctance on sort of even expanding the terminology of Africa Standby Force into the maritime space within Africa has centered on a feeling that this would just drain resources beyond what is even possible. But then we get to the really interesting piece, which is that maybe the problem is that we are trying to apply a set of terms that have one set of meanings to a set of issues that actually are best suited to something else. So Africa Standby Force, as I said, is not the same thing as a NATO Standby Force, even at the outset. But when we get to the maritime space, we should be looking at, all right, what is happening? What does exist? Where are things in Africa, particularly at the multinational level? And interestingly, because of the maritime security challenges that the continent has faced through piracy, through drug trafficking, even through humanitarian assistance and disaster relief issues, there have been sort of novel approaches taken to cooperative maritime regimes. And rather than replace them or supplant them by a standby force, maybe we should look at whether those existing cooperative mechanisms can be strengthened or emboldened further. And so we have an Africa Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050, which was established in 2014 by the African Union to set forward a vision for a continent-wide maritime security. Now, the challenge with AIMS 2050, as it's known, is that the African Union is the sort of owner of that strategy, but it lacks a maritime department. It doesn't have maritime expertise. It doesn't have maritime abilities to essentially steward that strategy into implementation. And when it has had personnel assigned to it, they've often been at the operational level, not the strategic level. So, the push then ends up being for, some kind of room in the African Union with a bunch of screens showing maritime traffic around the continent. Interesting idea, not exactly what implementing a continent-wide strategy needs, though. That is not, it's sort of a mismatch between the strategic and operational levels. And so that strategic leadership from the AU has been in many ways lacking, with one growing exception, which is the understanding of the blue economy. And so, unfortunately, the Africa Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050 has become more of an economic focus than a security focus, and it doesn't necessarily recognize that security development nexus, that you really can't develop unless you have security. And so there's an inherent challenge there, and a lot of the security focus then has essentially been decentralized to the different regions. And there are essentially 3 cooperative blocks now that are worth discussing. So in Eastern Africa, the piracy spike in the early 2000s led to a 2009 document called the Djibouti Code of Conduct. And the Djibouti Code actually integrates not just the eastern seaboard of Africa, but it goes out through all of the African islands, as well as the other Indian Ocean islands like the Maldives. Plus, it goes up into the Gulf. So it includes the likes of Yemen and Saudi Arabia and others. And so the Djibouti Code of Conduct was the first sort of major statement or mandate for multinational cooperation within the continent to combat a common threat, in this case, piracy. It involved a couple of different regional centers. It involved a couple of different mechanisms for cooperation. And it had an effect on sort of bringing everybody together to combat this common threat of piracy. In 2013, the Gulf of Guinea, which is not necessarily the geographic Gulf of Guinea, but the wider Gulf of Guinea, which covers most of Atlantic Africa, came together and through ECOWAS, ECAS, and the Gulf of Guinea Commission, took the concept of that Djibouti Code of Conduct and sort of upgraded it a little bit and said, look, piracy is a problem now. That's a big spike. We got a concern around it. But we have other concerns. We have illegal oil activities. We've got illegal fisheries. We've got trafficking of drugs, weapons, humans. We've got all these different maritime challenges. Let's look at illicit maritime activity writ large. And so the 2013 Yaoundé Code of Conduct created not just a mandate to cooperate on piracy, but a mandate to cooperate on all illicit maritime activity for all the coastal countries, as well as some of the landlocked countries, or as they call themselves, land-linked countries, within the 2 economic communities of Western and Central Africa. And what that led to was a whole architecture of maritime security cooperation with the Interregional Coordination Center headquartered in Yaoundé, in Cameroon, and then 2 regional centers, one Cresmac in Pointe-Noire, Congo, and Cresmail in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and then zones. And the zones are an interesting thing because the zones, in some ways, one of the zones at least predates this other architecture. Zone D, which is Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and Sao Tome, had recognized that the zone notion was coming and started cooperating on the issue of piracy in particular back in 2009. And so they started, without even all that much in the way of paperwork to do it, figuring out operationally how to work together. So how do you do combined operations? How do you share information? How do you share maritime domain awareness? How do you work together as a unit? And it's been really interesting watching Zone D evolve over the years, because they have been front and center of the models of zonal cooperation. Now we also have Zone A, which is Angola and the Congos, Zone E, which is Benin, Togo, Nigeria, and Niger, Zone F, which is a rather large zone headquartered in Accra, but it's Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, and now the most recent addition in terms of a multinational coordination center is going to be in Praia, Cabo Verde. We have the last several countries, so Guinea-Bissau, Gambia, Senegal, and Cabo Verde plus Mali, all working together to secure their respective zones. And each of the zones has had different sets of challenges, both in terms of the threat environment, but also in terms of figuring out how to work together. Zone D, as I said, started with an operational cooperation and then sort of created paperwork off the back of it. Zone E started with a big legal agreement and still are trying to get to the point of the operational. And so there are a lot of really good lessons, not just for Africa, not just for Atlantic Africa, but globally on maritime security cooperation that can be drawn from these different approaches, because we can see what works, what has created challenges, what has relieved challenges, how to deal with issues like hot pursuit, how do you deal with actually going into each other's waters. There are all kinds of things that are really valuable from the lessons out of this architectural stand-up. But I think many would agree that as much progress has been made, as much success as we could attribute to this architecture, it hasn't met everybody's aims and goals. There's still a lot to be desired in terms of both security cooperation and responsiveness of this architecture to the threats that are always evolving. Now, that said, we're benefiting right now from a period of relative calm in the Gulf of Guinea. We've had the lowest amount of piracy activity in decades over the last 2 years. And part of that is not just that this architecture has had some success and that the navies at the national level have all improved. We've also seen improvements in that other end, that legal finish piece. We've seen prosecutions, and the moment that you realize that the main consequence of going out and committing piracy might not just be catch and release, but actually spending the rest of your life in prison, it does change a little bit the mentality of the relatively few individuals who actually go out and commit these crimes. So we are seeing a change. And then the third of the cooperative blocks between the Djibouti Code, the Yaoundé Code, and the rest of the continent is the 5+5 Defense Initiative. And I'll come back to Djibouti in a moment, because the 5+5 is kind of unique. It is 5 North African states, Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, plus 5 Southern European states. So I think it's France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Malta, all working together to deal with Mediterranean security in particular. And there's very little to point to in terms of the operational level of that. But one of the things it has done is provide a mechanism for communication between some of the states that don't normally talk to each other on land. So Algeria and Morocco, for example, have closed diplomatic relations for decades. They've closed border, yet have the necessity of cooperating on the maritime space. And this provides at least a conduit for being able to do that. And so it's probably the least developed, but still an important mechanism to know. Now let's go back to the East, because that's where I think our focus has to be going forward. And Djibouti Code of Conduct started out with this piracy focus. In 2017, having seen the Yaoundé Code upgrade to all illicit maritime activity, we saw what have become known as the Jeddah Amendments. So a regrouping of all the Djibouti Code countries to come together in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to say, look, we're expanding our focus beyond piracy to now include other illicit maritime activity, trafficking of different sorts, illegal fishing, etc. And that sort of increased the potency of the Djibouti Code, but at the same time, it increased the necessity to then be able to actually do something about it. And within that, what we saw was a cooperative block that actually started with the 5 Indian Ocean islands. So Seychelles, Mauritius, Madagascar, Comoros, and the French island of Reunion, called the 𝒊𝒎𝒂𝒒 program, the Maritime Security in Eastern Africa program, 𝒊𝒎𝒂𝒒. was to create two different centers, the Regional Coordination Operations Center in Seychelles and the Regional Maritime Information Fusion Center in Madagascar, to actually do this cooperation, to help make it happen. And interestingly, having worked around the world, one of the things I've noticed is that islands, which inherently are smaller and have, they have more maritime space and fewer resources to deal with it, are often the first to come up with ways of pooling resources, of cooperating, finding ways of marshaling regional capacity when domestic national capacity won't be enough. And these two centers have really started to have some impact. And it's so much so that other states have wanted to join. So the original 5 became 7 when both Kenya and Djibouti both joined. And now, as of just this past December, the area of responsibility for those two centers, originally started under the Indian Ocean Commission, has expanded to cover the full Djibouti Code of Conduct countries. And so there's currently an evolution that's happening in terms of how to marshal this cooperative blocks. And countries that aren't even on that eastern seaboard, including Angola and Namibia, have indicated an interest in being part of that. Now, Namibia is kind of an anomaly. If you look at Djibouti Code, Yaoundé Code, and the 5+5, it covers every coastal country in Africa but one, and Namibia is somehow left out of it because it's not part of any of those economic communities. So we're looking at sort of a realignment starting to happen now based on who's providing a service, who's actually benefiting the maritime space. Now, all of this goes back to tie back to our Africa Standby Force concept. There's a lot of work that has already been done to create these cooperative blocks, to create multinational entities, forces, meetings, organizations. I mean, there are so many different cooperative mechanisms between SHADE, the Shared Awareness and Deconfliction, MOCA, the Maritime Organization, West and Central Africa, all of the things that I've already talked about, different commissions, different entities, different meetings, Friends of the Gulf of Guinea, the contact group on it had been piracy, is now illicit maritime activity off of Eastern Africa. So you have all of this different infrastructure that now exists for maritime security cooperation. To then come in and say, and now we need a maritime standby force. It is ludicrous in some ways when you look at the resources that are available and the challenges that exist with implementing what has already been decided at the national and regional levels. And so how do we then get to the concept of that standby force function if we're not going to actually get to an actual standby force? And I think this is where we need to be more creative and suspend our definition of terms in the colloquial to look at the functions. And so what is the point of the standby force? The point is to hopefully provide a mechanism for maintaining peace and security within Africa. And if we're looking at peace and security in the maritime space, it has a very different meaning. We're looking largely at maritime security threats, which are often about crime, piracy, trafficking, illegal fishing, those sorts of crimes. And we have mechanisms that now are existing, that are beginning to work, beginning to function. Let's support them and make sure that it is understood that those mechanisms are de facto, if not de jure, the standby force. But then we get to this interesting sort of turning point that has occurred over the last few months, because everything I've said thus far indicates that there's no naval conflict in Africa, right? We haven't had a naval war. We haven't had, the state-on-state combat in the maritime space, and we probably won't. I mean, that is not a threat that we should be really all that concerned about trying to guard against, because in fact, creating the forces able to guard against it is actually creating the forces able to actually make it a reality. Exactly. So there's a weird sort of conundrum there. What's the chicken? What's the egg? And then we get to the Houthi attacks that began on the 19th of November. And yes, the Yemen is physically not in Africa. I'm very aware of the geography. However, there is a very narrow 17-mile strait between Djibouti and Yemen. That means that they are very, very close, and what happens on one side of the Red Sea affects the other side. And in fact, what we've now seen is that what's happening in the Red Sea affects all of Africa. And there's a really bizarre dynamic that has occurred. I mean, in modern history, we have not really seen a non-state actor attack maritime commerce, right? In the way that this threat has evolved. And the Houthis have been, since so they've gone through 5 phases of escalation. The first was their attack on the Galaxy Leader, which was actually similar to what we've seen elsewhere, right? Piracy, where you take a vessel hostage and you bring it into your own country. That has happened numerous times in Somalia, Nigeria, elsewhere. So that in some ways wasn't all that novel, although landing a helicopter and televising it, right, and then turning the captured vessel into a museum or tourist attraction with the crew still as hostages on board is not something we've seen anywhere else. And that's a bit of an anomaly in and of itself. But that was the first phase of the Houthi attacks, and they have never done it again. So they were one and done on capturing a vessel. Since just after that, though, they've gone through 4, what I would say, co-equal levels of escalation, and co-equal in the sense that they are all continuing.
Right.
They're not mutually exclusive. So the first was the aerial bombardment using both missiles and drones. The second were surface-based attacks using both manned and unmanned surface assets. The third were the unmanned attacks, and the fourth of that, so 5 overall, has been an information operation that has become very, very clever in terms of its approach towards commercial shipping. And that brings me to a really key point, which is that the Houthis haven't attacked. Their primary attacks have not been against other navies, although they have. We'll come back to that in a second.
Yes.
The US and the UK have become lightning rods for them, but their attacks were targeted against commercial shipping in the maritime space, which benefits all of us. But the commercial shipping isn't about one country carrying goods for itself on its flag vessel with its own people. We have globalized shipping to the point that any given vessel anywhere in the world could be carrying cargo that has ties to 50, 60, 70, 100 countries. And that's really important to remember, is that the notion that you could attack a ship of a personality that is tied to the US, the UK, or Israel, as the Houthis have claimed, is somewhat ludicrous. You can pick almost any vessel, and it's likely going to have a tie to one of those 3 countries, given the financing, the insurance, the cargo, just the amount of participation of those 3 countries in trade makes it a very challenging prospect to distinguish ships that do or do not have those ties. And so to anybody who thinks that this is really about Israel-Gaza, it is not. I've dealt with the Houthis. I've been analyzing the Houthis for years. They are a singular group. And the problem that we've had with dealing with them since the 19th of November is that we've failed on rule number 1 of strategy, which is to know your opponent. We have not understood who they are, what they're after, what their mindset is, how they operate. And as a result, we've made some tremendous mistakes that have ultimately, unfortunately, had a direct impact on the situation, but also on Africa. And I'll come back to that in 1 second. But the Houthis have used this narrative for their own benefit, that they are protesting Israel-Gaza. It is no secret that they do not like Israel. They've been very prolific in explaining and expressing their desire to see Israel no longer exist. But part of why they want it to no longer exist is that they want Jerusalem as the headquarters of the empire they are working to build. They see themselves as a part of a movement, a holy imperial movement that will ultimately, as far as they're concerned, control Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. And that means that they are willing to kill anyone that gets in their way, and they're willing to do all kinds of things to destroy the current order of both borders and legal operations around the world. So attacking maritime commerce, even though it theoretically affects them, is not something that they would ever rule out. So now we're seeing that they've actually embraced it. And equally, if you look at the notion that they are protesting what is happening in Gaza, you only have to scratch the surface of that to see that they are incredibly hypocritical. 375,000 people have died in Yemen in the last decade because of the Houthi efforts to overthrow the government and to take control of the country. A lot of those people, the majority of those people, have died because of Houthi weaponization of food supplies, of other things. To the extent that people have been killed, I think it's worth noting that in Taiz, one city alone, that the Houthis have their eye on. The Houthis have, looking through a sniper scope, killed over 375 children. So if they're upset about the deaths of innocents, that's kind of laughable, because their approach has been often to kill innocents. That is exactly what they've gone after. Equally, they are interested in Israel, but I don't think really want Israel to stop. They are enjoying the security that Israel is providing them. Why do I say that? Israel safeguards them against any kind of intervention from the rest of the neighborhood. If you look at who is most affected, one country comes out very quickly. It's Egypt. They are losing a huge amount of money off of the decrease in activity in the Suez Canal. Canal revenues, canal fees alone get them about $9.5 billion a year. The overall value of the canal to their GDP is about $56 billion a year, and they're at about a 56% decrease in normal activity right now. That hurts anybody. So why aren't they standing up? Why aren't they saying anything? Well, because as long as we allow for the Houthis to continue to know that this is a protest against Israel-Gaza, nobody wants to see anything that might be perceived, even domestically, as being something to support Israel in continuing that. So Israel has essentially become the security guarantor for the Houthis. They can keep attacking shipping. They can make the neighborhood incredibly difficult, challenging, put them under all kinds of economic pressure, as long as that narrative is still linked, because nobody wants to support Israel by countering the Houthis. And that is a mistake that we've made from the outset by not understanding that they couldn't care, that they have killed more Muslim Arabs in the last decade than Israel has in the entire history of its existence. So it's a staggering mismatch in terms of what they say and what they do. Never, ever listen to what the Houthis say. I mean, listen to it, sure, but believe it, never. They have been 100% perfect in never abiding by anything that they've committed themselves to. If you go back to every agreement they have signed, they've never stuck to it. And if you go in thinking, well, this time it'll be different, I mean, it's sort of buyer beware. Like, you should recognize that you're assuming a huge risk, and that you would be the first to experience them actually abiding by it. And so the notion that what the Houthis are saying is actually true is somewhat ridiculous. And so going back to the personality of ships, the Houthis don't care if they actually hit a US, UK, or Israeli linked ship. If they get it wrong, they're just as happy. Why? Because on the 18th of November, 2023, the Houthis have been in existence for decades and nobody knew who they were.
Right.
Security analysts, regional security analysts, barely paid them any attention, even though they had overthrown the government of Yemen and had taken about a quarter of the Yemeni territory through a civil war over the last decade. And yet they were barely on the map in terms of groups that people talked about. Yes, we would talk about Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, all these other groups that we're used to speaking about. But who are the Houthis?
Yeah,
people
we're talking about them today.
Exactly. And since the 19th of November, they have become front page news on an almost daily basis, to the point that they don't even have to launch an attack. All they have to do now, to my point about information operations, is claim that they have. So they can now say several times now they've claimed attacks that didn't occur, and yet that still made the news. And so they've entered a whole new realm of existence for their sort of general imperial ambitions. But they've also validated some of their claims, or we've validated on their behalf some of their claims, in that they have said for about 10 years that they were at war with the US and the UK. That was part of their ethos, part of their false narrative. Now it's true. They have been attacked by the US and the UK. We played right into their narrative. And so that validation has given them incredible emboldenment. It's given them momentum. It's given them the ability to recruit. They've gotten huge new numbers. They claim to have recruited 200,000 people in the last several months. I mean, it's massive upswell. And as long as some who are empathetic to the Israel-Gaza cause think that they are actually protesting it, they're benefiting from that false narrative as well. And so there's been an incredible, I mean, this has been the best few months ever for the Houthis. And to think that exactly, and to think that our strikes are having the desired effect is somewhat laughable. The Red Sea is less safe now than it was a month ago, and it's less safe then than it was the month before.
Even with the increased presence.
Even with the increased presence, even with the increased activity. So why? Deterrence is a relative concept, and our attacks have gone after things that the Houthis don't care about. We've taken out gifts from Iran. We've taken out presents that were, as far as they were concerned, replenishable and didn't actually affect their core interest, their core motivation. Their core interest is in imperial. That means they care about territory. Nothing we have done has reduced their territory. If anything, it's given them the motivation and the upswell of energy to expand. So
again,
ironically,
disjoint between maritime and that.
Exactly, and so they found that attacking the maritime domain, A, was easy, and B, had incredible benefits. Unfortunately, the whole world is now watching them, and so that is a lesson that could potentially be learned by others. And if we look at even beyond the security context or this defensive context of threats to the maritime space, we have seen tremendous amounts of strategic shock over the last few years in the maritime domain. The Ever Given getting stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days cost the shipping industry. It was done forensically by Ernst & Young to find an exact dollar amount. They came up with $416 million per hour. Okay, that's an incredible amount of money. And that was one ship getting stuck in the canal just for 6 days. We're months now into this event, and we have a 56 to 60% decrease in the amount of traffic going through both the Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez. Where that really comes in for Africa is twofold. One, some key African ports who are part of key supply chains, including Port Sudan, including Djibouti itself, are feeling a huge decrease. What goes into those ports? It's food, medicine, goods, supplies, all kinds of things that are critical to life on land. 90% of world trade happens by sea, and we forget that until it starts being interrupted. And if we think back to the pandemic, we felt all kinds of interruptions. But Ever Given, we saw different shortages, bizarrely, just from one ship blocking a canal for 6 days. So what we're now seeing is that the inaccessibility of some of those ports in the Horn of Africa is creating increased pressure on other supply chains and other routes that are already quite precarious. You have a lot of tension in the Horn right now. You have conflict in Sudan. You have a growing conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia. You have ongoing challenges in Eritrea. You have a whole powder keg of issues that could be greatly affected if food supplies, medical supplies, and general basic goods do not make their way to those states. And as I said before, Egypt, at the upper end of that, is experiencing somewhat catastrophic economic decline as a result of the situation. So not about accessibility, but about income. So you have the whole northeastern portion of Africa suffering a direct consequence. But the rest of maritime Africa is also feeling this. Why? Because with the effective closure of the Red Sea to a lot of the containerized traffic that was going through, we still are seeing bulkers and tankers going through, but most of what have rerouted are the container vessels that carry our actual physical goods. They are now going around the continent. That means that the Cape of Good Hope has seen about a 135% increase in traffic. That has other implications. That has all kinds of different challenges, security challenges, but mostly practical challenges. So let's just take the most basic example. What happens if a cyclone comes through, a storm system comes through, and some of these big ships need safe harbor? most
Where
of
do
the
you go?
African ports can't either absorb just the number, but even can't absorb some of the ships themselves. They physically can't visit African ports because they're not deep enough, they're not big enough. And so we have a weird mismatch between the vessels that are sailing and the ports that can handle them. Equally, ships need fuel. Are the ports able to supply enough of the bunker fuel? What's going in that bunker fuel? Is it of a high enough standard to keep everything going, or is it being diluted, or what's happening? Can they provide other services, clean water, food supplies? So African ports are actually seeing a major increase in traffic, putting a lot of pressure on them. And when there is that kind of upheaval, even though that is potentially a really positive thing for Africa, could be marshaled to incredible economic benefit, there are other challenges that come with it. And one of those challenges is maintaining security. And so we've seen now 20 piracy incidents off the coast of Somalia since the 22nd of November. That is a lot more than we had seen in the previous 7 years. So
primarily due to the increase in traffic and the lack of stability.
And the drawing of attention. So as forces and attention gets drawn elsewhere, and as there's inspiration now, everybody's remembering that actually it's pretty easy to attack the maritime space, comes with all kinds of benefits. We see a mismatch. Now, the Houthis don't care about money. They're not attacking to try to get a ransom of either the crew or the cargo or the vessel itself. But others who do want money may see opportunity in this. And so now you have increased organized crime groups, terrorist organizations, others may find all kinds of inspiration from what's been happening. And this is where not necessarily an Africa standby force, but at least the function of an Africa standby force needs to be strengthened, because we need those cooperative mechanisms. The 𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒂𝒎𝒑𝒔 with the 2 centers in Eastern Africa have been very busy trying to monitor the piracy, to make sure that everybody's coordinating. Gulf of Guinea and the Yaoundé architecture needs to step up and ramp up the vigilance to deal with this increased traffic.
Would you think that the nominal existence of the African standby force, even if it isn't practically active, is a demonstration of collaboration, which is kind of helping so many states to stay unified against the common enemy of criminality and terrorist organizations?
Well, and I think it's such an interesting point, because again, like the concept of the African standby force wasn't collective self-defense. It wasn't that like external actor attacking Africa as a whole and sort of unifying to defeat something outside. But that's exactly what it needs to become in the maritime space. And so conceptually, there needs to be some kind of translation from that inward-looking Africa standby force on land to a more outward-looking one on the water, to make sure that there is that cooperative approach to securing essentially a continent that is an island. And
do you think that there is within Africa and the desire, the willingness for that change in direction, considering how things haven't developed the way the assumptions might have been?
I don't know if it exists yet, but I think the will would be there if the translation of what's happening in the maritime space was effectively made to the political classes. Nowhere on earth have we overcome the issue of understanding the maritime domain's nexus to our life on land. Most political leaders don't think about the maritime space. If you're in a democracy, why would you? No voters live there. It's out of sight, out of mind. And you don't even think of about the waters you do control. Until there's a problem. And so we need to figure out how to better articulate the critical importance of the maritime space to life on land. Ironically, some of the landlocked states get it better than some of the coastal states, because it's not right. Not having it makes them realize what they don't have. So you see states like Uganda and Ethiopia now really pushing to have much more of a focus on maritime access. You had Niger contributing a marine patrol aircraft to Zone E. You have other states that have this sort of recognition that actually goods come in, goods go out via the maritime space. And even though we don't have a coast, we have an interest in protecting what access we have. And so collectively, I think that the political leadership of Africa needs to recognize that, yes, it does make sense that your focus is life on land. when you're trying to make sure people are fed, housed, that there are roads, that there are housing, that there are schools, that there's all the stuff and infrastructure that you need on land. It is very difficult to say, yeah, we need to devote time, resources, capital towards the maritime space. But not doing so is a direct negative consequence on all those other issues. If all of a sudden food supplies aren't coming in, if export goods can't get out, if there is no ability to access that global market, everybody suffers. If medical supplies aren't coming in, and your population ends up sick or harmed by it, it makes it very difficult to make any kind of other progress. So we need to do a better job of articulating why it is that there needs to be that collective threat, and that's not unique to Africa.
No,
the amount of maritime ignorance is overwhelming globally because of our natural tendency to think about life on land.
and what you're mentioning there is, would it be fair to say that perhaps the Chinese in the South China Sea are beginning or have already sort of understood that if you can be the boss of an entire area, then you're also the boss of everything that happens there.
Throughout history, every rising power has gotten to that tipping point where it's realized, all right, the next thing we need to control are the seas.
Right.
The history of global preeminence in terms of powers has always included controlling the maritime space. You can't get to the top without it. And part of that is that recognition of not just naval power, but economic dominance through trade routes. And that's generally where that tipping point occurs. And so the notion that the Houthi attacks aren't affecting Africa is laughable,
right?
Because they're affecting everybody, but they're actually having a disproportionate effect on Africa because of that increased traffic, because of the supply chains that are directly affected in the Red Sea. And so this is an opportunity to potentially re-envisage, as you said, rethink the African standby force concept in the maritime space as not being about one that's inward looking, but about being one that is externally focused, looking at threats that affect the continent collectively, and that can marshal the existing cooperative resources of the primarily counter-piracy efforts that have been stood up through the 2 regional centers in Seychelles and Madagascar, through the Yaoundé architecture, and through the 5+5. So there's a lot that can be said.
So I'm glad this is being recorded because I'm so looking forward to it. Even though I'm sitting here with you, going back and listening to it again, because it's your level of knowledge and ability to explain it in such a simple, straightforward, and yet very, very detailed manner is incredible. I've heard in the past people say that the maritime domain, people tend to collaborate more easily because of the lack of direct political influence when you're out at sea.
100%, yeah.
Is it absolutely necessary that in order to deal with these issues, the political aspects of states and governments, etc., are going to have to modify their approach to communicating and dealing in almost a more maritime manner?
It's a fascinating question. I think what we see are operators often find the imperative to cooperate while at sea. And sometimes the only way to get past the political is to ask for forgiveness, not for permission.
Right.
We do see these cooperative blocks that essentially originate at the operational level and then get elevated. And often those are the most successful. The ones that start with a big piece of paper at a high political level, don't get implemented.
The standby force might be a perfect example.
Precisely, conceptually sounds great.
Yeah, but everybody else gets on with their work in the meantime.
Exactly. And so what is it? What is the function that needs to be done? And so politicians have the somewhat luxury of being able to make statements without having to necessarily confront the ramifications of them straight away. Whereas operators are dealing with issues day to day, and they have a completely different perspective in terms of their existence. And so what I think we need to do is find ways to encourage support to that operational level, support to that imperative to cooperate.
Right. And if I might ask, how would you see, although in many ways you already answered the question, what would your opinion be? not based perhaps on current evidence, but on having worked with so many different people, what would your opinion be of the likelihood of the African standby force, even though it's not necessarily your domain, because of course that's maritime, but of it achieving any of its original goals? Or on the other hand, would you see that it will remain a sort of a notion, and the regional aspects and the regional actors who are practically participating and having success will continue to be the focus? How do you see it going?
I think the Africa Standby Force as a whole will always face certain continent-wide challenges. Where it may end up being successful is at the brigade level at different regions, if somebody is willing to be bold enough to actually put it into use. And I just don't know. I don't know what the appetite is. Things are swaying. We've seen all kinds of pretty significant upheaval in terms of governments in the last 3 years across Africa. And that somewhat mitigates the likelihood of it being used. If there's a fear that it's going to get used against you, why would you want to use it again, in someone else's? And I think sovereignty is a critically important concept in Africa, and as outsiders, we're not always all that sensitive to it. And so we often are more willing or prone to think of intervention to uphold values that we find preeminent. But sovereignty is perhaps the single most important value. And so violating sovereignty against the will of a state in order to intervene in a conflict is a very tough decision to make within Africa. And so
and a lot of those conflicts, of course, are ethnical, they're cross-border, they're perhaps not necessarily the same borders that we consider that have existed for many years.
Where I could see this coming up, right now we're seeing tension growing between Ethiopia and Somalia over the Somaliland port deal that was signed between the president of Ethiopia and the president of semi-autonomous Somaliland on the 1st of January this year. If the two countries go to conflict over that, this is where the African Standby Force, would theoretically have been there to be deployed. And given that the seat of the AU is in Addis, I could see that maybe being a tipping point. And ironically, it would have a very close maritime nexus given the subject matter. But I'm hopeful that conflict won't escalate to the point of violence. But equally, I'm not sure that without a UN Security Council resolution or other clear international support, we would get over that inertia to actually deploy, or not we, the African leadership would get over that inertia to deploy the standby force. Even though East African Standby Force has a functional brigade, it hasn't been put to the test in the real world yet. I don't see that happen. So, yeah.
And then the final impossible question: what's going to happen over the next few years in the Red Sea in relation to the Houthis and fires?
So the Houthis are going to continue to seek expansion unless we pull their attention away from the maritime domain. They will keep attacking. There are several layers of escalation further that they could pursue. One is to attack submarine cables, which they've threatened to do repeatedly. They claimed they had an attack, but in fact it was the dragging of an anchor by the Ralby, which ultimately sank. The next would be to potentially attack farther afield, which they've said they will do. Iranian technology has proven to be able to deploy out to 1,000 miles for a drone strike. That's pretty significant. And if you look at 1,000-mile radius around Houthi-controlled Yemen, that's pretty far afield. The third would be to actually attack someone else. To attack the naval base is in Djibouti. Land-based. Yeah. So there's a lot that could happen. And there's a multi-dimensional aspect to this with Iran, with Israel, with Gaza, with other neighboring states. And so I called it in Newsweek the other day a Rubik's Cube of hell. Every time you turn, you get another bad option. But it's going to be escalating and changing over the coming days, weeks, months, years. And I think we're in for a long road ahead. And I think Africa needs to do a couple of things. One is think about how to develop that cooperative, collective resilience against maritime threats, including piracy, including terrorism, including even illicit activity like trafficking of different sorts. Because with that increased traffic, there are increased challenges. The second is to take a positive spin on it, which is think about how to become more of an attractive business community to ingrain some of these new supply routes, to provide services that make it attractive to maintain operations. And that is a real benefit. And I think the third is where NATO comes in, which is to reach out to other entities, to engage with other entities, not to have, funding or activities done, but to benefit from expertise and learning about cooperative experiences. NATO has made so many mistakes over the years, had so many challenges, had so many difficulties that as an alliance, we've kind of learned to deal with. Capturing those lessons has been a major focus, but sharing them hasn't.
Right.
So, we have a Center of Excellence in Lessons Learned. We have all these different mechanisms for bringing together some of those ideas. How do we then allow for Africa to benefit from them as they work to become more collective in their defense against maritime threats of all sorts?
Well, I certainly hope that today's event has helped sharing, because you have certainly shared in an incredibly professional and knowledgeable manner, and I am very grateful on behalf of the Hub, and I'm sure all of our viewers are equally grateful. This has been quite an experience. I would like to remind those watching, excuse me, because we've just gone over time, that this will be recorded on our YouTube channel at 𝒂𝒒𝒒𝒒_NSD-Hub. And if I might, Ian, although very briefly and a little bit too quickly, thank you so much again for today.
That's my pleasure.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Goodbye to you all.